This is Growing Up Aspen Season 2, where we're actually going to deep dive with a bunch of folks that we actually grew up with. Usually it's Chris Pomeroy and myself, Andy Collin, but today it's just Mike Marolt and I. And one of the things that I was wanting to hit was that you talk about work and then you talk about your hikes. And it seems like that's another thing where how do you shape that to work? In other words, it seems like you've got a pretty good crew. You've got you, your brother, and Jim. So you got three of you guys to rely on, but you each have your different lives and all that stuff. So I feel like for a lot of folks, trying to fit that into their everyday life, how do you manage that? Because other folks probably, it feels like a skill we need to learn.
Well, it's important on a number of levels. I think that, when I was a young guy, I wanted to, be a guide. I wanted to figure out a way that I could just be in the mountains all the time. And I remember my dad said, Mike, if you turn your passion into your job, it becomes work. Right. He said, just go out and climb and ski and have fun. And he said, I had to earn a living. I didn't have a trust fund or anything. Right. And I had to earn a living. And so I fell into accounting, and it became a stable source of income for me. And, it's kind of funny. I was just telling my daughter this the other day. It's like when I worked for Pete Marwick, which was one of the big accounting firms, for 3 years. And then I moved back to Aspen and I became a controller at about 6 or 7 different places. And she said, well, at the same time, and I said, no, I'd work for one and I'd go on a trip for a month. And then the next spring would roll around and I'd ask for another month off. And that job ended because, people just didn't want to. They couldn't handle me being gone for 4 weeks every year. And then I'd move to the next job and I'd go through the same process again. Yeah. And so finally, after getting hired and fired a half dozen times because of my climbing career, I realized that I just needed to go into business for myself. And that was the best decision I ever made because it has allowed me to have a career and I love what I do. But as it relates to the climbing and skiing, a lot of our trips were sponsored and we had, great relationships with people that allowed us to fund those trips. Even though we were low ball climbers and didn't use all the perks, it was still expensive. And so we needed those sponsorships. But for a long while, we had to pay for it all ourselves. So I had a job where I could save my pennies and go and do it. So that was the first benefit. The second benefit, I think, is that when you're training and you're climbing and skiing a lot and you're going out on these expeditions, one of the big benefits from what I do, being a CPA, is that I have, a lot of weeks every single year where I'm just sitting there doing work. And climbing and skiing, especially in the 5,000 to 8,000 meter arena, you get back from one of those expeditions, you're toast. You're toast for anywhere from a month to 2 months. And so my sedentary lifestyle as a CPA allowed me to recover in between not only workouts, but expeditions. And so it just became a complement to the climbing and skiing. And then, being a CPA is probably not too hard for people to understand that after doing that for several months, you probably need a break. So you go out and you take the ultimate break to get away from it and you go climb and ski a peak. So it was kind of a neat recipe for success that a lot of people, especially climbers, have a hard time understanding.
Right. Well, the other thing too is for folks getting into the industry. Your world is like my world too. With dealing with sponsorships is really, really important. And how did you start that? And how important is that in your climbs now? It seems like it's a big help in several ways, not just financial, but also in like recognition in the community and stuff. you know.
So are you asking about the sponsorships for the climbing and skiing, or?
Yeah. When you go out and search for that, because it's like I remember a lot of the kids on the ski team. By the time they were out of high school, they were starting to talk to sponsors for skis and stuff. And
Yeah.
I mean, even in high school, they were. Michael Dayton, I remember he was sponsored, and it felt like so. That is a key influence that a lot of people don't really realize. I mean, we're in a world of influencers now, so that kind of is like people understand what that means, but it's important. Sponsorship is important, and that means you got to work with people. That means you got to kind of adjust how you approach yourself so that you can appeal to this person and that. And there's a dance that you need to do to get sponsorships. And can you speak to some of that? Because in the climbing community, it's a little different than skiing, but you're kind of straddling both.
Well, that's a really interesting question. And if I had to accomplish what we did starting today, it'd be a completely different game, and it'd be a lot more difficult. Back when we started to get into this, it was right at the advent of the technology boom that we see now in AT gear. I mean, for the first 10 years, the peaks that we skied, we climbed and skied those in climbing boots because there was no such thing as an AT ski boot. But we kept after it, and as I said in the Shishapangma book, had a lot of slam doors in our face, had very little interest, and it was tough. And then Shishapangma was a really key turning point in our career because it was a big feather. It was the first time anybody from North or South America had ever climbed and skied from an 8,000 meter peak. And the fact that we did it without Sherpa support and without oxygen, just like we have since then on all of our climbs, that was an element that added a little validation to a really big accomplishment. And it gave us a little bit more of a resume to go to these companies. But even at the time, as far as getting ski gear and boots and bindings and skis, that was still a tough sell. And over time, it became a little bit easier. But what we figured out was we could go to corporate America. And it was so new and it was so unique. I mean, now, there's, hundreds of thousands of people buying AT ski gear. Back then, it was really rare.
Yeah.
And it was unique. And I remember I have asthma, so I called up the rep for my asthma meds, and I became a spokesperson for Merck Pharmaceuticals.
Right.
And then we went to Go to My PC was this program that a lot of people use now that allows you to dial into your computer if you have access to the internet. And at that time, satellite phones were coming in, and so we thought, well, we use Go to My PC. Let's go to those guys, and we'll tell them we can show us working at Everest Base Camp on Go to My PC doing tax returns. That generated a huge sponsorship. And then it kind of, rolled into Under Armour was a new clothing company, and they came out with a extreme mountain outerwear line. And so we, went to Boogie Wineglass, who knew the guy who started it, Kevin Plank, and we had lunch with Kevin Plank in Aspen, and we, formed a relationship there. And this is even before really email, and we would get these deals with these people, and I don't remember why, but it was always for a certain amount of money every year, but they could only pay you twice. And after the initial agreements for those things, and it came with the film stuff was a huge part of it too, but you had to have a film, and that's the reason why I started producing films. I'd just send them a snail mail invoice, we need 30 grand or whatever it was. And, you'd never hear from them. And then, 2 weeks later, you'd get a check. And most of the money went into the film production because you had to offer them, footage and stuff like that. but it was really, I've often thought that the story of how we did that, it was just the perfect timing in how corporate America was evolving and what they were looking for. And that's how we funded all those trips. Now I just have to be transparent.
Yeah.
I've never referred to myself as a professional climber. And outside of a laptop computer and a copy of First Cut Pro to produce films, those are the only two personal perks that I've ever had. But all of the money that we did generate, and it's a significant amount, 100% of it went into the films and the expeditions. And I was able to finagle all that to, take Steve and Jim on all these expeditions. And it was kind of fun for me. But I contrast that, and I have young people come up to me, how did you do it? How did you do it? And it's like, you don't have the benefit of something as unique as film now. Back then, I had to take classes at UCLA to learn how to edit, and I had to work with a bunch of pros to figure out how to shoot climbing and skiing. There weren't a lot of people doing it. You couldn't just point your iPhone and get, 4K footage.
Right.
Today, young people don't have that option because everybody's making films. I mean, there is no independent adventure film market now.
There's video editing software on your phone.
Yeah, exactly. That wasn't the case. So it was those films were the catalyst. It's like if I could go to Merck Pharmaceuticals and say I'm making a film, I mean, it was automatic. It was a 5-minute discussion.
It still takes your creativity to say, hey, I've got asthma and I'm going to, the peak.
Yeah.
If I go hit those guys up and say, hey, I can go to this peak because I'm doing, and sort of that takes creative thinking on all the different pieces and possibilities, because that's kind of, a lot of people aren't going to make that jump. But you almost have to be that creative and look for every little piece or place. And out of those 50, 10 are going to hit, and 10 will be what gets you on your way.
And that's what I tell young people today. It's like, you have no idea how many letters and emails went unresponded to. I was constantly sending pitches out. And the lights went on with that Shishapangma trip because we were short money, and we thought, oh man, we're going to lose our money that we paid for the permit. It's non-refundable. How are we going to come up with $15,000 to, get ourselves over there and pay for the rest of this trip? And then Wilcox, I was actually working for him at the time through my accounting practice. And he came into the office and he said, oh, what am I going to do? I got all this money and I don't have any expeditions and I got to finish the series. And the lights went off. But the lights went off not just for that expedition. I realized that through that process, I needed to figure out how to either find people that had an interest in filming our expeditions. We weren't too keen on having film crews with us at the time. Not that we were snobs or anything. We just didn't have the experience to look after a film crew. We were comfortable maintaining ourselves, but the lights went off, and I trained and I practiced and I worked at shooting, climbing, and skiing. I mean, it's kind of funny. When the kids were growing up, I would try to take videos of the kids.
Yeah.
And I was just awful. I just couldn't do it. I'm a one-trick pony. I know the angles. I know how to get a decent climbing and skiing shot, but I can't film anything else. And it's because I just practiced. Every time I went skiing, even on, Aspen Mountain or something, I'd take a camera and I'd just shoot. And I just learned how to do that. Not that I'm a great photographer or anything like that, but I learned how to do it well enough to take the camera and some video on the trips and to come back and to throw it together and make these films. Yeah, and those films were a critical element in our development as climbers, not because it made us famous, but because it allowed us to, approach these people in corporate America and individuals that wanted to help out to raise money to do the expeditions and to produce the films. So, I've produced 7 or 8 films, and three that have done well and been distributed, and that's how we were able to afford it. I mean, there's this notion that the Marolt brothers, because of the Marolt Bridge and the Marolt property and the Marolt this and the Marolt that, are just these wealthy guys, and I just try to tell people, I mean, we were comfortable, but I mean, my dad was a ski rep. Right. His dad was a bartender at the Red Onion, and his mom,
Yeah. Well, that's the Aspen local. That's the Aspen local part where everybody was somebody in everyday life. Yeah. And whether they were the bartender, the waiter, whether they did this, everybody had several jobs. They had all these different things they did. And so it felt like the community, that's what sort of made the community. Whereas now you got a person who comes in with the jet and then they fly out with the jet. And so there isn't that need for that, or that existence for the community. Like you say, it's down valley now. And
and Andy, the other thing that's kind of cool is that back when we were in our heyday in the 8,000 meter arena, we would go on these expeditions, and even back then, the typical price tag for an Everest expedition, fully, commercial, guided, everything was a lot. I mean, it was like 50,000, 50 to 100,000. Now it's, $250,000. Right. But it was a lot of money. And somehow we found ourselves at the north side of Everest and at the base camps of all these famous peaks and everything. And, our nut for the three of us was always $10,000. Right. And the reason for that is because we didn't use guides. We didn't use supplemental oxygen, which is hugely expensive. We didn't have espresso machines and cafeterias at base camp. It was dirtbag climbing at its best.
Well, it's what you guys were used to, just the mountains here, Yeah,
exactly. So it was just a different breed. And, I had a young person say, well, I want to go and try and ski the North Ridge like you guys, but it's like $150,000. And I said, well, are you going to use a guide? And he said, well, of course you have to. And I said, why? You've got the experience. You don't need a guide. I mean, you can do it. You can do it for a fraction of the price, and but it's just along the lines of the earlier discussion. It's just a different world, and I'm glad that we were able.
The frontier was sort of not necessarily made. In other words, we were sort of on the early stages where there wasn't. Now everything's so developed and so much stuff has happened that it's different. You're not on the cutting edge. Oh, we need to make this thing for that. Oh, because it doesn't exist. Okay, I'll use this instead of that. Now there's a device that's actually made for that.
Yeah. It's just a different world, and it was a lot more simple back then, and we made it even more simple than it was back then, just because we didn't have the money to do it like everybody else was doing it. So, and that was kind of a pain in the ass at the time, but it was also gave us a sense of pride. We were the other element that played into our minds is that we were old enough to appreciate when Reinhold Messner climbed Everest without oxygen the first time, because that was in 75 or 76. And there were a lot of unwritten ethical rules that changed when he did that. Now it made people look at people who used oxygen in Sherpa. He didn't use any of that stuff. And, we didn't use any of that stuff when we're climbing Castle Peak or the Maroon Bells or anything. And that was just a style that influenced us to be the same way. And we figured, well, we may not be Reinhold Messner, but we'll just go to as far as we can on the peak. And if that's the summit, great. And if it's not, well, then our summit is a little bit lower. And but it helped economize everything for us and make it a lot more doable.
Well, you lived in dryland training too, so that helped. Yeah. In other words, you were in that kind of atmosphere, just in a different place. The reason why Alexi Graywall got gold was because he trained up Independence Pass. Going and bike racing up in the Malibu Hills is nothing compared to Independence Pass.
That's right. Yeah.
When you got that little extra kick in the back of your step, why not go? And it was like, okay, take it, go for it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we took advantage. I mean, growing up in Aspen and being fifth generation Aspenites.
Thanks for listening to Growing Up Aspen, a Joiner's Table podcast with our classmates. We'd like to thank the Aspen Times and the Aspen Daily News for letting us include some of their materials in our book, Growing Up Aspen, Adventures of the Unsupervised. The authors would like to thank you. If you're interested, you can check out our book at twistandturnpress.com.